There, Social Studies 20-2. We're looking at source number 3 today in our look at foreign policy. It is a photograph, as you can see, of a Tokyo residential area after the American firebombing of March 10th, 1945. Tokyo, Japan, of course. So you might talk a bit about, what it means to firebomb a residential area. Um, you're going to be talking about the concept of total war. So we actually talked about this last week. Total war was a war where you deliberately went after the civilians. The intent was if you kill enough of their civilians, you will get their country to surrender that way. So it's a change in terms of the accepted rules of warfare. Now, the firebombing of Japan wasn't the only example of total war from World War II. As we learned, Dresden, London, and so on. But this being a picture of Japan, you're going to want to talk about it. Um, so you might talk about why they went after the civilian population, what it means to go after a civilian population, how you're trying to bring that country to surrender. Uh, and you might talk about just how this neighborhood, this city is decimated, devastated in terms of human life and also economically too. It's going to cost a lot of money to rebuild the city if they ever really can. And you're going to want to comment on the tragedy of killing civilians, as the result of World War II foreign policies. In terms of linking it to uh, outcomes from the course. Of course, the theme is foreign policy. The date is right there in front of you on the photograph. Participants would be the American military, specifically the American Air Force. There's not a whole lot of evidence that you can really look at and point out other than saying that, judging from the photograph, that Japanese neighborhood is decimated. The fact that there are no buildings practically left standings would tell you that all those people are dead. You might speculate on how many died. I had read well over 100,000. You might even talk about how that firebombing mission alone killed more people than the two atomic bombs put together later on in 1945. So the evidence is going to be a discussion on total war. And that would also lead into your historical case study too. This is something that actually happened in history, and it's an event that when we look back on, we judge it, we might critique it, but for sure you're talking about that. In terms of connecting it to nationalism, this would be tricky. You're going to use expansionism, but it wasn't really American expansionism. America was fighting back against the Japanese policy of expansionism. Japanese expansionism led them to bomb Pearl Harbor in 1945, which drew the Americans into World War II to begin with. And so, from that perspective, that's how you're using expansionism. America was fighting back against Japanese expansionism, culminating with the photograph that you see, the firebombing of Japan. Other things we could point out and link it to would be um, isolationism. America maybe remained in isolationism too long in the interwar period. Many critics and authors have pointed out that America really should have known that Japan would be coming to them by 1941, even as early as the 1930s. It had become pretty apparent that Japanese expansionism was going to bring them into conflict with America at some point. So maybe critique the American policy of isolationism. You're going to use ethnocentrism, in that America, in many ways, was fighting that war because of Japanese ethnocentrism. That ethnocentric attitude, in many ways, drove them to the expansionist policies. And then, total war was a way that America quelled it and stopped it from continuing. Clearly, an example of foreign policy. And you might say that ultranationalism is what drew America into the war as they fought back against Japanese expansionism. Maybe a better way of saying it is that ultranationalism led to Japanese expansionism, which in some ways, you know, forced America to do what they thought was the way they were going to win that war, and that was firebombing civilian populations. In terms of perspectives, you're going to think about, discuss, what would Japanese citizens think about this? What would they think about the American tactic of total war, what would they think about their government? Um, and even, drawing them into World War II altogether. And then what would be the American perspective based on the photograph? What would Americans think? They would probably say this is something we had to do at that time to save American lives. This was the only way we could defend ourselves against Japanese aggression. That might be a road that you go down in terms of establishing perspectives. Okay, good job with that.